Michael Johnson, a seasoned rescue worker, had seen countless disasters during his 13 years of service in Chicago. On a chilly autumn night, the fire station's alarm blared, signaling an emergency. Michael and his team quickly geared up and rushed to the scene, a blazing old apartment building on the city's south side. Thick black smoke billowed from the windows, and the heat was intense. Michael's heart pounded as he navigated through the inferno, focused on rescuing anyone trapped inside. Flames licked at the walls, and the sound of cracking would echoed through the narrow hallways. Amidst the chaos, he heard a faint cry for help. Following the sound, he kicked open a partially ajar door to find a small boy, no older than 6, huddled in a corner, clutching something close to his chest. "Hey, buddy," Michael called out, trying to keep his voice calm. "I'm here to get you out." The boy looked up, eyes wide with fear. He didn't move, frozen by the terror surrounding him. Michael moved quickly, crossing the room in a few strides. He knelt down and extended a gloved hand towards the child. "My name is Michael. I'm a rescue worker. I'm going to get you out of here, okay?" he said gently. The boy hesitated but then nodded slowly. As Michael scooped him up in his arms, he noticed a glint of metal around the boy's wrist, a chain bracelet with a photo charm. Michael's breath caught in his throat. The bracelet looked identical to one his younger brother, Alex, had worn before he disappeared years ago. There was no time to dwell on it. The ceiling above them groaned ominously, threatening to collapse. Shielding the boy with his body, Michael made his way back through the burning building. Each step was a battle against the heat and smoke, but he pushed forward, driven by a surge of adrenaline and determination. "Stay with me, kid. We're almost there," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if the boy could hear him over the roar of the fire. Finally, they burst through the front entrance and into the relative safety of the street. Michael staggered out, gasping for fresh air, and gently set the boy down on the pavement. Paramedics rushed over to check on him. As they worked, Michael's mind raced with questions. The bracelet, how could he have it? It looked exactly like Alex's. Michael took off his helmet, running a hand through his sweat-drenched hair. He approached the paramedics, his voice rough from the smoke. "Is he okay?" he asked. "He'll be fine," one of them replied. "Just some minor burns and smoke inhalation. We're taking him to the hospital to be sure." The boy, now breathing more steadily, looked up at Michael. His eyes were still wide, but there was a hint of gratitude in them. He opened his mouth to speak, his voice a faint whisper. "Thank you." Michael managed to smile. "You're safe now. What's your name?" "Tommy," the boy said softly, his fingers still clutching the bracelet. "Tommy, that's a strong name," Michael replied, kneeling down to his level. "Where did you get that bracelet?" Tommy's eyes flickered down to the charm. "It was a gift from my daddy," he said, his voice trembling slightly. Michael's heart pounded in his chest. "Do you know where your daddy is?" Tommy shook his head, tears welling up in his eyes. "He's gone. Grandma says he went to heaven." The weight of Tommy's words hit Michael like a ton of bricks. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his emotions in check. "I'm so sorry, Tommy. Can you tell me where you live? Where your grandma is?" Tommy nodded, giving him the address. Michael quickly relayed the information to the paramedics, who assured him they would take care of everything. As they prepared to transport Tommy to the hospital, Michael found himself staring at the bracelet again. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a coincidence. After ensuring Tommy was safely on his way, Michael stood by the now smoldering building, his thoughts a whirlwind. The familiar design of the bracelet kept flashing in his mind. He remembered the day Alex had received it, a family heirloom passed down through generations. It had always seemed special, almost magical to him. Michael knew he couldn't let this go. He needed to know more about Tommy, his family, and how he came to possess that bracelet. There were too many questions, and Michael was determined to find the answers. As the fire trucks and ambulances began to disperse, he made his way back to the station, his mind already formulating a plan. He knew he had to visit the hospital, talk to Tommy, and find out everything he could. For the first time in a long while, Michael felt a spark of hope. It was faint, but it was there, flickering in the depths of his heart. He had saved Tommy from the flames, but perhaps Tommy was the one who would help him uncover the truth about his brother's disappearance. The next morning, Michael awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. The previous night's events and the sight of the bracelet had ignited a determination within him. He knew he had to visit Tommy at the hospital and learn more about the boy's background. As Michael entered the hospital, the sterile smell of antiseptic and the faint hum of medical equipment greeted him. He approached the nurse's station, where a middle-aged woman with kind eyes looked up from her computer. "Excuse me," Michael said, leaning on the counter. "I'm looking for a young boy named Tommy Baker. He was brought in from a fire last night." The nurse nodded, her expression becoming serious. "Are you family?" "Not exactly. I'm the rescue worker who saved him. I just want to make sure he's okay and maybe speak with his grandmother if she's here." The nurse's eyes softened. "He's in room 402. His grandmother is with him. You can go on up, but please be mindful. It's been a very traumatic time for them." "Thank you," Michael said, offering a grateful smile. He made his way to the elevator, pressing the button for the third floor. As the elevator doors slid open, Michael stepped into a quieter, dimly lit hallway. He found room 402 and knocked softly. "Come in," a voice called from inside. Michael opened the door and stepped into the room. Tommy was lying in the hospital bed, his small frame almost swallowed by the crisp white sheets. His eyes lit up when he saw Michael, a flicker of recognition and relief passing over his face. Beside him sat an elderly woman, her expression a mixture of worry and exhaustion. "Hello, Tommy," Michael said gently, moving closer to the bed. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Tommy replied, his voice still faint. "Thank you for saving me." "Of course," Michael said with a warm smile. He turned to the woman. "You must be Tommy's grandmother. I'm Michael Johnson, the rescue worker who brought him out." The woman nodded, her eyes softening. "I'm Sarah Baker. Thank you for saving my grandson. I don't know what we would have done if—" Her voice trailed off, and Michael could see the fear and relief battling within her. "I'm just glad I was able to help," Michael said. He pulled up a chair and sat down, his gaze shifting between Tommy and Sarah. "Tommy told me that the bracelet he was wearing was a gift from his father. I was wondering if you could tell me a bit more about it." Sarah's expression grew guarded. She glanced at Tommy, then back at Michael. "Why do you ask?" Michael took a deep breath. "The bracelet looked very familiar to me. My brother had one just like it before he went missing many years ago. Seeing it again brought back a lot of memories, and I can't help but feel there's a connection." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. She reached into her purse and pulled out the bracelet, holding it up for Michael to see. "This bracelet was with Tommy when I found him. He was just a baby, left on the steps of a church. There was no note, no explanation, just this bracelet around his wrist." Michael's heart skipped a beat. "How long ago was that?" "About 6 years ago," Sarah replied. "I've been raising him ever since. He's the light of my life." Michael felt a wave of emotion wash over him. 6 years ago would have been around the time his brother Alex disappeared. Could it be possible that Tommy was somehow connected to him? The idea seemed almost too incredible to believe, yet the evidence was right in front of him. "Do you remember anything else about the day you found him?" Michael asked, his voice tinged with urgency. Sarah shook her head. "It was a cold, rainy night. I heard a faint cry and went outside to investigate. There he was, wrapped in a blanket with this bracelet around his wrist. I took him in immediately. I contacted the authorities, but no one came forward to claim him, so I adopted him and have been raising him as my own." Michael nodded, processing the information. "I need to know more about where Tommy came from. There might be clues that can help me understand what happened to my brother." Sarah looked hesitant. "Michael, I understand your need for answers, but Tommy has been through so much already. I don't want to put him through any more pain." Michael reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Sarah's. "I promise I won't do anything to hurt him. I just need to know if there's a chance that Tommy is connected to my brother. If we can find out more about his past, it might help us both." Sarah studied Michael's face for a moment, then sighed. "All right, I'll do whatever I can to help, but please be gentle with him. He's just a child." "I will," Michael promised. He turned to Tommy, who had been listening quietly to their conversation. "Tommy, would it be okay if I asked you some questions about your bracelet and where you came from?" Tommy nodded, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Okay." Michael smiled, grateful for his bravery. "Do you remember anything about your daddy? Anything at all?" Tommy thought for a moment, then shook his head. "No. Grandma told me he went to heaven when I was a baby." Michael nodded, not wanting to press too hard. "That's okay. Do you remember anything about where you lived before you came to live with your grandma?" Tommy's brow furrowed in concentration. "I remember a big house and a garden with lots of flowers, but it's all fuzzy." Michael's mind raced with possibilities. "Thank you, Tommy. You've been very helpful." Sarah looked at Michael, her eyes filled with concern. "What do you plan to do next?" "I need to dig deeper," Michael said. "There might be records, something that can give us more information. I'm going to visit the church where Tommy was found. Maybe they have more details." Sarah nodded. "I'll come with you. Tommy and I will do whatever we can to help." Michael felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you, Sarah. Together, we might be able to uncover the truth." As Michael left the hospital that evening, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The bracelet was a link to his past and perhaps a key to finding out what happened to his brother. He knew the journey ahead would be difficult, but with Sarah and Tommy's help, he was determined to follow the trail no matter where it led. For the first time in years, Michael felt the spark of hope ignite within him. The next day, Michael, Sarah, and Tommy made their way to the church where Tommy had been found 6 years ago. The church was an old stone building with stained glass windows, standing at the end of a tree-lined street. It had a serene and welcoming presence, and Michael hoped it held more pieces to the puzzle. As they entered, the interior was cool and quiet, the air filled with the faint scent of incense. An elderly priest was arranging flowers at the altar. He turned as they approached, a gentle smile spreading across his face. "Good morning," he greeted them warmly. "How can I help you?" "Good morning, Father," Michael replied. "We're here to ask about a child who was left on the steps of this church about 6 years ago." The priest's expression grew serious. "Ah, yes, I remember that night well. Such a sad and mysterious event. Please, come sit with me." They followed him to a small sitting area near the back of the church. "My name is Father James," he said as they settled into the chairs. "I was here that night when we found the baby. Can you tell us more about that night?" Michael asked. Father James nodded, his eyes distant as he recalled the memory. "It was a rainy, cold night. I was closing up the church when I heard a faint cry. I went outside and found a baby wrapped in a blanket with a bracelet around his wrist. I brought him inside, tried to comfort him, and then called the authorities." "Do you remember anything unusual about that night?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with hope. Father James shook his head. "I'm afraid not. There was no note, no sign of who might have left him, just the baby and the bracelet. We cared for him until the authorities arrived." Michael took a deep breath. "That bracelet is very important to us. My brother had one just like it before he disappeared. We're trying to find out if there's a connection." Father James looked thoughtful. "I'm sorry I can't provide more information, but you might want to talk to the woman who found the baby first. She lives nearby and was the one who heard the cries and alerted me." Michael's heart skipped a beat. This was the lead they needed. "Can you tell us where to find her?" Father James nodded and gave them the address of a small house a few blocks away. "Her name is Mrs. Wilson. She's a kind woman, and I'm sure she'll help you if she can." They thanked Father James and left the church, feeling a renewed sense of hope. As they walked to Mrs. Wilson's house, Michael felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. They were getting closer to the truth, but he knew they had to proceed carefully. Mrs. Wilson's house was quaint and cozy, with a well-tended garden. Michael knocked on the door, and a moment later, An elderly woman with bright eyes and a warm smile answered. "Hello," she greeted them. "Can I help you?" "Good morning, Mrs. Wilson," Michael began. "We're here to ask about the baby you found on the church steps about 6 years ago." Mrs. Wilson's eyes widened slightly. "Yes, I remember that night. Please, come in." They followed her into a comfortable living room filled with the scent of freshly baked cookies. "Please sit down," Mrs. Wilson offered, gesturing to the sofa. Michael explained their situation, the bracelet, and their hope of finding a connection to his brother. Mrs. Wilson listened intently, nodding as she took it all in. "That night has always stayed with me," she said softly. "I heard a cry and went outside to investigate. There on the steps of the church was a baby wrapped in a blanket with a bracelet around his wrist. I picked him up and took him inside the church where Father James and I cared for him until the authorities arrived." "Do you remember anything else about that night?" Sarah asked gently. Mrs. Wilson thought for a moment. "It was so long ago, but there was something unusual. I remember seeing a car driving away as I approached the church. It was dark and I couldn't make out the details, but it struck me as odd. It was almost as if someone was watching to make sure the baby was found." Michael's heart raced. "Do you remember anything about the car? The make, model, or color?" Mrs. Wilson shook her head. "I'm sorry, it was too dark to see clearly, but I do remember it was an older model, something you don't see much of these days." "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson," Michael said, gratitude evident in his voice. "You've given us a lot to think about." As they left Mrs. Wilson's house, Michael felt a renewed sense of determination. They were closer to the truth, but there were still many unanswered questions. The next step was to get the DNA test done to see if there was a biological connection between Tommy and his brother Alex. A few days later, Michael, Sarah, and Tommy sat in the clinic's waiting room, the minutes ticking by slowly. The DNA test results were ready, and the anticipation was almost unbearable. When the technician called them in, Michael's heart pounded in his chest. The technician handed Michael an envelope. "These are the results. I hope they bring you the answers you're looking for." Michael nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he opened the envelope. He read the results, his eyes scanning the page quickly. Then he looked up at Sarah and Tommy, his expression one of awe and disbelief. "It's a match," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Tommy is my nephew, Alex's son." Sarah hugged Tommy tightly, tears streaming down her face. Michael felt a mix of relief, joy, and a renewed sense of purpose. They had found the connection they were looking for, but there were still more questions about Alex's fate. As they left the clinic, Michael knew they needed to dig deeper. He decided to visit the police station to see if there were any old records or leads that might have been overlooked. At the station, he met with Detective Brown, a seasoned officer who had been involved in investigating Alex's case. Michael explained the situation, showing Detective Brown the DNA results and recounting the story of Alex's disappearance and Tommy's discovery. Detective Brown listened carefully, then nodded. "I remember your brother's case. It was one of those that haunted us because we never got any solid leads. But now that we have this new information, it might be worth taking another look." Detective Brown pulled out the old case file and spread the contents across his desk. Michael felt a wave of nostalgia and sadness as he looked at the photos and reports. They went through the details, piecing together the timeline and the few clues that had been gathered. "Look at this," Detective Brown said, pointing to a note in the file. "There was a report of a suspicious vehicle near the area where your brother was last seen. The description matches the car Mrs. Wilson saw that night at the church." Michael's heart raced. "Do you think it's connected?" "It's possible," Detective Brown replied. "We can run the plate number again, see if anything comes up." A few days later, Michael received a call from Detective Brown. "We found the owner of the car. It was registered to a man named Peter Miller. He has a history of minor offenses, nothing major, but he lived near the area where your brother was last seen." Michael's hands trembled as he listened. "Do you think he could have been involved?" "It's hard to say," Detective Brown said cautiously, "but it's a lead. We can bring him in for questioning, see if he knows anything." The questioning of Peter Miller revealed a crucial piece of information. Miller admitted to being involved in a small-time gang that operated in the area back then. They had crossed paths with a young man who had a baby and was trying to escape a dangerous situation. They had helped him find a safe place for his child before he disappeared. He was desperate, Miller confessed. He said he couldn't let them find him or the baby. He made us promise to keep the baby safe. Michael felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Alex had been trying to protect Tommy from something or someone. Do you know where he went? Miller shook his head. No, after that night, we never saw him again. We heard rumors he was trying to get far away, start a new life, but we don't know what happened. As Michael left the police station, he felt a sense of closure. They might never know exactly what had happened to Alex, but he knew Alex had done everything he could to protect Tommy. He walked to his car, the evening sky turning shades of purple and gold, and felt Alex's presence with him. A comforting warmth that reassured him he was on the right path. Back at Sarah's house, Michael hugged Tommy tightly. Your daddy was a hero, he said softly. He loved you so much and did everything he could to keep you safe. Tommy looked up at him with wide eyes. I love him too, even if I never got to meet him. Michael smiled, his heart full. And he loves you, Tommy. He's always with us, watching over us. They decided to hold a small memorial for Alex, a celebration of his life and his love. Friends and family gathered, sharing stories and memories. It was a day filled with tears, laughter, and a deep sense of connection. As the sun set, Michael stood by Alex's photo, Tommy by his side. He felt a sense of peace and hope. They had found answers, but more importantly, they had found each other. The night sky sparkled with stars, and Michael looked up, feeling Alex's presence. We're going to be okay, he whispered. Thank you for bringing Tommy into our lives. Tommy squeezed his hand, and they stood together, united by love and the unbreakable bond of family. The world felt a little brighter, a little more hopeful, and Michael knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together.